Okay, so today we're going to talk a little bit about where to go when we're serving and when the other team is serving. We're going to talk about a 6-3 offense, which means that we have 3 setter/hitters, and, well, all 6 players will also be hitters at some point. There are a couple ways to play this system, from a simpler version to a more complex version, and it might be a nice way to get players ready for more advanced offenses later in their career. I'd love to see a lot of under-16 teams get into running this by the end of the season. First, let's talk about the overlap rule. If you've already seen this from one of the other videos, you can skip ahead to the next chapter. But the overlap rule applies before the ball's been served by our team or by the other team. So once the server contacts the ball, we're free to switch positions and go wherever we like. We're going to use this a lot later when we talk about our positioning in the 6-3 offense. As a back row player, you can't line up in front of the player in front of you, and front row players can't line up behind the player behind them. So the player in 4 can't be behind the player in 5, the player in 3 behind the player in 6, and the player in 2 behind the player in 1. You also can't cross over the player next to you. So the player in 4 can't be to the right of the player in 3, and the player in 2 can't be to the left of the player in 3. Same goes for the back row. Those players can't cross over each other either. So legally, we could all hide and huddle in zone 4, so long as we all stayed on the right side of the player or players to our sides and in front or behind us. If they wanted to, the 2 middle back players could back all the way up, which is fine because the back row player stayed behind the front row player and they didn't overlap to the right or left of the people beside them. Or our middle back player and right back player could shift to the right side. So long as they don't cross over each other or cross in front of the players in front of each of them, everything's fine. So that's a quick overview again of the overlap rule, and we're going to see that in action a little bit in our 6-3 offense. So what does a 6-3 look like? Well, we have 3 setter hitters, we're going to call them, and 3 hitters on the court. Who are just, their only job is to hit. They don't ever have to worry about setting, those ones with the H1, H2, and H3. The players who have to concern themselves with setting at some point, not all the time, but at some point during the rotation, are S1, S3, and S2. So in the example above, player S1 is going to take the second ball, so they're our sort of active setter. And S2 and H1 will get to hit. And the back row players, if you're running a back row attack. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. S2 and S3 will set at some point in the rotations. But the other players, H1, H2, H3, as I said, only have to worry about passing and hitting. So it's a nice way to start training some prospective setters while letting kids who have no interest or aptitude for it to be relieved of the pressure of setting. Because it takes a certain mindset to become a setter. We're going to start with the simpler version. You can see we're highlighting our setter hitters there in this particular setup. So let's start with that simpler version. Okay, so in this version, we're going to name 3 players as our setter hitters, and we'll place them every other player. And when one of those players is in zone 3 or 2, they will act as the setter on the court. So they're meant to get the second ball, and we'll set the players in zone 4 and 3 or 2, depending which zone they happen to be in. But let's see this in practice with the setter in zone 2 first. So here, when we're serving, there's no switching, so it simplifies things for our players. Like we would have switching in a 4-2 or a 5-1. Everyone can just play defense and block where they stand. Person who served would just go up. That setter, the active setter, S1 in zone 2, is ready to go, and things are going to kick into action when the other team returns the ball back to our side, either with an attack or an easy free ball. It's our turn to transition to attack ourselves. So ideally, the back row players will pass the ball in that rough seam between zones 2 and 3. And the S1 player will have moved to that spot to get ready to set the ball to the H1 or S2 players in zones 3 and 4 in this setup. So that's the idea, is that player in zone 2, that S1 player, would always step up and take that second ball and try to give a good set to one of those other two players. That's in transition when the ball comes over the net. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go. Now, when it's our turn to receive serve with a setter in zone 2, we have a few options for organizing our passers. The S1 player could squeak all the way over to the right side to let that H1 player hit from the right side if they're not comfortable hitting out of the middle. That would also mean that they can move a little bit more to the right, so they're able to pass a ball a little bit more comfortably and they don't have to go too much to their right. Or we can squeeze the S1 player over to their base position as a setter, where we expect to pass that first ball. And either keep H1 out of serve receive, so they can kind of duck up at the net, or just have them receive any balls that might fall a bit short. We have to respect the overlap rules, of course. No front and back overlap, and none side to side. You can see the arrows. The orange arrows represent the connections between the two players in front and behind each other, whereas the other arrows are pointing at the players to either side. Now, in this case, the H1 player can now either hit the ball in front of the setter, if we want, or behind the setter, depending what the setter's comfortable with, what the hitter's comfortable with, maybe even depending on the other side, if your team is getting really advanced and they can check out the block and the defense on the other side. So lots more options, and we start to get a little bit more sophisticated with this 6-3 offense. Now in the next rotation, we'll have one of that S1 player goes back to serve. They're no longer the setter for this rotation. It'll be that S2 player because they've moved into zone 3. So like in the other case, no one needs to switch. No one needs to move from their starting position. H1 can hit from the right side. H3 can hit from the left side. And there we are. Not a lot of movement. So again, much simpler for all of our players to practice and understand. Now, when we go to serve receive, it's going to look the same as in transition. H3 and H1, we can form kind of a cup there with all of our passers. S2 can stand right in the middle as the setter, and they can set either ahead of them or behind. So this one's, again, a little bit simpler. We can see very clearly that there's no overlap because everyone's standing just about in the zone that they belong in. So we get that pass in, and the setter is able to set either in front or behind. And then we follow that through the next rotation. The next rotation, S2 is now in zone 2, so they're still the setter for those 2 rotations. S3 and H3 are in the front row, so we're able to set to either one of those 2 players. And again, just like that first version that we showed you, we would go through the same options for when we're receiving serve and when we're attacking the ball. So that's the simplified version. I like that a lot, especially when we're starting out, because we do have 3 setters in every team we've fielded on the court. So it's a really good chance for lots of kids to get that experience of setting the ball. And then those kids who just don't have the mentality, they can just swing away, and we can start grooming them to be middles or outsides or even opposites. So once they've gotten this system, we can think about moving on to the next step. So for the next step, we're going to start thinking about getting them ready for moving on to more advanced systems, like a 5-1. And there's lots more movement involved, and a little bit more thinking. There are more hitters involved as well in the front row. So let's go take a look at that. So like I said, this is going to get us ready for the 5-1 offense or any offense where the setter is coming from the back row. So it's going to require, because there's more movement, it's going to require a bit more patience on your part and definitely on your player's part. We still have the 3 setter hitters, and every other player is still designated a setter hitter. But the difference comes when we'll have whoever is designated a setter in zone 1 or 2. So instead of 2 and 3, we now have a setter coming from the back row. So they're meant to get the second ball, and they're going to set the players in zones 4 and 3 and 2 if that setter hitter is in the back row. And if the setter is in the front row, like here with S1, they're going to set just those, they'll have just 2 hitters available to them at the S2 and H1 player. So let's see this in practice. So with a setter in zone 2, it all unfolds the same way it does in the simplified version. Everyone can play pretty much where they stand. So nothing changes at all from the first version I showed you, so nice and simple. Everybody sticks where they are, not a lot of movement, not a lot of things to get confused about. Again, when it's our turn to receive serve with a setter in zone 2, we have a few options. Like before, same options for organizing our passers. The S1 player could squeak all the way over to the right side again to let the H1 player hit from the right side. They can stay at the base position. I think I'd probably prefer that, just so we don't have our setters moving too much and they're in the spot where the pass should be passed to. Of course, we still respect the overlap rules. They're the same as they were before for the first version I showed you. Just reinforcing that. And when the ball comes in and is passed, again, that H1 player has the option to go in front or behind. And this is where we can get more sophisticated, having our hitters and setters talking to each other, letting them know where they want to hit the ball. So it's when the setter hitter gets into zone 1 where things get interesting. When we serve and get ready to play defense, it looks all the same as before. That S1 player goes to play defense and right back. Not a lot of switching, not a lot of complexity, pretty straightforward. But when we have transition as our next wrinkle to this version of the 6-3, transition happens when the ball is being played on the other side of the net and we're playing in defense. And they send the ball over to our side, whether they attack it or they're just passing the ball back over to us. We have a chance now to turn around and attack. So if the other team hits the ball back over the net to us and it's not hit at that S1 player, they run to the net to set the second ball. The 3 front row players, H3, S2, and H1, they all get off the net and get ready to hit. If it is hit at S1 and they happen to play it, they should probably yell for help, and another player, ideally one of the other people designated as a setter, would jump in and play that second ball and set one of the other players in the front row. But that's a whole other thing to train that we'll look at a little bit further down the road. So that setter has to be thinking when they're playing defense in zone 1, right back, they need to think, oh, I've got to get to the net. If that ball comes over the net, I need to get good at getting to the net and setting that ball to one of 3 hitters. So they also have to think, not just, I got to get to the net, but who am I going to set the ball to? All right, so when it comes to receiving serve, with the setter in zone 1, this is where we can organize ourselves in lots of different ways, thanks to the overlap rule. This is one way you might do it. That might be the easiest starting point for your players. You can stack the setter from zone 1 with the hitter in zone 2 on the right side. And then let that hitter in zone 3 come back to help form a sort of cup when receiving the serve. So you have 4 passers. Now, when they pass the ball, the setter's going to have a very short way to step to take that second ball. And then you're still respecting those overlap rules. So the setter would just step up into that seam where the ball would ideally be passed, and then the hitters would get off the net to get ready to hit. And H1 just has to step back down that right sideline to get ready to hit. So that's one option. Another way to do it, and this might be the final step before you're ready to move on to something like a 6-2 or a 5-1, is this setup here, where we have our H1 back up and our S1 goes as far forward as they can without overlapping with that H1 player. And you can see we have pretty simple, everybody else, but we have that setter stacked just behind H1, and as soon as the ball is contacted, that's when they're going to run to where the ball is going to be passed to, and the hitters are going to get off the net and get ready to attack. This is great training for the setters when they're running a 5-1 offense and they're setting all the way around, especially in that rotation one that can be so tricky for some teams. They get in the practice of kind of hiding behind the outside hitter and not being afraid to, as soon as that ball's contacted, break for the net and get ready, get in their spot before the ball's even passed. So they have a chance to react and chase down the ball if it's not a good pass. It's a little bit more complex running the 6-3. There are two different ways to do it, like I showed you. I really like the first way as a starting point when you're ready to move off of the 6-6, where everybody sets when they're in one position or another. It's a little bit more advanced, so maybe it's a little bit more exciting for the kids. They're starting to play more like the pros play. And then when they're ready to make that shift to the next step version of the 6-3, they're really making complicated volleyball decisions, and those setters are thinking a lot more on the court. And that's where we can see some of those young players really start to develop for us and become amazing setters down the line. So I hope that helps. That's a quick rundown of running the 6-3.